Welcome to the occasional Free the Animal podcast, where only the immediate and essential gets published. This is your host, Richard Nikoley, and today I'm interviewing Mr. Alex Leaf, a nutritionist, personal trainer, and health and fitness writer. We're here to talk about recently published direct observation that shatters many myths about what Paleoman really ate. You'll be surprised. Without music or further delay, let's jump in. Hey folks, so I have Mr. Alex Leaf on the line with me, and just to give you a little bit of background, last May or June, in a Facebook exchange I had with him, he turned me on to something that I was completely unaware of, and why I was unaware of it might be somewhat the same reason you have been unaware of it. When in fact, what we're gonna learn later on in the podcast is it's, even though the study was recently published, the awareness of it is nothing new, and in fact goes perhaps back as far as the early '80s about what Paleoman ate instead of what we believe they ate in the narrative. Welcome to Free the Animal podcast, Alex.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on.
So, tell us, you hearken from where, and give us your background and what you're up to right now.
So I live in a suburb of Seattle, Washington called Bellevue, and I just recently graduated earlier this year with my master's in nutrition from Bastyr University. Although I've been involved in nutrition writing and research for the last half decade, which I started doing while I was getting my undergrad from Washington State University. So currently I have a master's in nutrition. I'm a certified nutritionist. I'm a certified sports nutritionist. I'm a personal trainer. And I just recently launched my own private nutrition practice called Leaf Nutrition, which anyone who's listening to the podcast who would be interested in online consultations can check me out at leaf-nutrition.com.
Sure, and we'll put the link and all that stuff in there, all the posts we're going to talk about. Um, so so what is you have had you I notice you're on and about, you're here and there in the sports nutrition field. Um, Subversity guy. I've been a big fan of his for a long time, so I see you here and there, and you blog at what's called Superhuman Radio, which I think is probably a performance or sports based sort of thing. So, so where does your interest in the core kind of let's throw everything in the bag there, paleo, primal, ancestral, and perhaps even low carb ketogenic. Where does your interest does it originate from there, or did you come up across it along the way? What?
Well, that's kind of how I got started in nutrition, actually. I've been an avid athlete my whole life, mainly doing wrestling since I was in elementary school. And that led me to have a disordered relationship with food. And one of the ways that I overcame that disordered relationship was through changing my diet to what is conventionally a paleo diet. And it started with Lauren Cordain as well as Mark's Daily Apple and a lot of kind of the mainstream paleo guys back in 2010. And so that's what got me interested in it. But then as I just started doing more of my own research and becoming more well educated in nutritional science, I started to have a lot of questions about what they were promoting. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am now, where, I don't like to question the good and the bad of everything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, just Okay, so now back, I got into this about, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. So we're talking 2007, 2000, or 2008 probably, when I started really getting into this. And one of the things back then was people in the context of paleo, people were talking a lot about the Katavan research.
Hmm.
Do you remember that? Stefan Lindbergh, right? The Swedish guy.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
showing that.
and
Oh, go ahead.
it was very interesting because there was obviously they ate plenty of carbohydrates, and their protein didn't seem to be coming from like big game. It was more like polywogs and stuff, as I recall. Um, did you have any experience in that or look into it very much?
Um, well, I wouldn't say I looked into it very much. It's always kind of been a great example of how there is no one single paleo diet because the Kitavans, I mean, their diet was 70% carbohydrates, and so it goes in the face of a lot of what the traditional paleo movement would have had you believe.
So
Um,
so so then okay, yeah, and I agree. I didn't look into it deeply myself, but what I did do remember and recall is the way in which it was kind of just brushed. It's like, okay, that's interesting. It was brushed aside. Do you have any ideas of why it wasn't like, wow, because paleo is becoming is so it's such a well, originally it was more of a protein emphasis, and so many low carb started really saying, hey, there's something to this paleo bandwagon thing and getting in there. So it has seemed to focus more and more on fat and meat. Do you have any ideas of why the Katavan might have been dismissed or brushed aside?
well, if I had to make one educated guess, it might be that when you look at modern society and where the majority of carbohydrates come from, they come from grains and refined grains. And the Catawans consumed most of their carbohydrates from starchy tubers like taro and the such. And so, I mean, their carbohydrate was pretty high, so they could be considered more of an outlier society. But I think the issue more so was that if people said, look, these people are eating carbohydrates, then its interpretation wouldn't have been, okay, so eating a lot of starchy tuber carbohydrates is okay. People would have just focused purely on the carbohydrate aspect, and it would have been harder for the paleo movement to promote their anti grain agenda.
Now, and how about like area, because it's somewhat tropical there in Papua New Guinea, right? So it could have been
Mm.
dismissed because it's like, well, it's kind of outlier. They don't they didn't particularly dismiss Inuit, which is as outlier as you can
Yeah.
possibly get, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
Well, it fit their bias.
yes, it fits the bias, right? Okay, so let's move on to the post. So the name of Alex's post is "Eat First, Share Later: The Foraging Habits of Hadza Hunter Gatherers," and the Hadza are not. They're more of an arid environment in Africa, which
Hmm.
which is taken to be the pretty much the birthplace of all of Homo sapien humanity, and I mean humans itself. So not quite a place where the trees bear fruit, but there's seemingly a lot to eat around the landscape.
Hmm.
So Alex posts this, and it is based on about 12 years of research by people who were. Why don't you explain it to us, Alex?
Okay. So The researchers of the study, for whatever reason, were interested in the foraging habits of the Hadza hunter-gatherer tribes, and so they spent 12 years staying with every Hadza tribe that currently exists in Africa throughout every season of the year, and their goal was basically to stalk them, to just follow them as they went around on what they call walkabouts, which is when the Hadza men would leave camp in search of food. And the researchers would just follow them and observe what they were doing and collect the data. And so in February of this year, they published a paper in the Journal of Evolution in Human Behavior that basically reported on what they found over the 12 years. Mm-hmm. And it was those findings that I was basically the only person I know about to blog about. And I personally never heard of this study anywhere else. And I don't think you did either, Richard, which is why it kind of surprised you.
Yes. It's now, okay, so let's make a couple of distinctions here. So first of all, what this research reveals is that for a normal, true hunter-gatherer site, they get everything from their environment, right? They have very little contact with the outside world. I think the Hadza number about 1,200, 1,300 people and dispersed amongst a bunch of different tribes. And so when they actually integrated this out of this walkabout, this foraging behavior, they found that the men, in particular, get 90% of their total caloric intake outside of camp.
Yeah. On average, yeah.
On average, right? And so now let's juxtapose that with I think what is probably the thing that has been relied upon here. So just to make a distinction, back from year 2000, I think it was, when Lauren Cordain and Boyd Eaton et al. Published their analysis. It's called Plant Animal Subsistence Ratios and Macronutrient Energy Estimations in Worldwide Hunter-Gatherer Diets. And that's kind of been the standard that everyone has gone, that created the entire narrative. And of course, it was shortly after that Cordain published his book, The Paleo Diet. So juxtapose, what's the difference between these two studies?
It's that Cordain's analysis was based on the ethnographic atlas, which documented the average subsistence ratios of the various societies in the world based on what they were eating within their campsite. So this was data collected when the researchers would go and live with the populations, and they would eat within the campsite, and they would document what was being eaten within the campsite. Uh-huh. The current study that we're discussing is in contrast to that, in that it's looking at what is being eaten outside the campsite. Because the average walkabout of the Hadza people is 5 hours, and some of them lasted upwards of 13 hours. So it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't eat during that time when they're out there. And so that's what this study is it's reporting on the food that was consumed outside of camp, which we have no idea of.
So what? Okay, so what you're telling me is that these guys did a study and they sat in camp. What did they think was going on when guys weren't around during the day.
I have no idea what the researchers who just sit in camp and observe what's being eaten, why they would think that nothing was going on outside of camp is beyond me, because that seems like a pretty fundamental question to ask, especially for a researcher who's interested in the diet habits of these tribes.
So I had a guy who commented on this post, and the post that I did based on your post, that kind of speaks to this. Very interestingly, he commented, and it's from one of the researchers of the research that you blogged about was the guy named Marlowe, and I guess he has a book about the Hadza, which I was unaware of as well. Now I know, but anyway, so he posted on in comments last night. I'll just read it. Quote, it shows that berries dominate the foods brought back to camp during berry season, and again because the vast majority of berries are eaten while picking them out of camp. The amount consumed is even greater than suggested by Table 5.4 or Table 5.4. Quote, we have yet to finish analyzing total consumption both in and out of camp, but I estimate that as a fraction of the total food acquired, about 50% of berries, 40% of honey, 25% tubers, 20% baobab, and 15% of meat is consumed out of camp. So, and this commenter's analysis is, yes, the exact percentages of foods eaten out of camp were not known. Obviously, even Marlowe was off in his estimates. He actually underestimated, especially with honey. But even in papers as early as 1980s, anthropologists have known about this out-of-camp eating. Hawks and many others have followed foragers on their trips and recorded what, how, and how much they ate. So this is not really new. It's been around for a while. Cordain has missed this because his estimates are pulled out of his ass. That's an aside. But I read this stuff and I'm like, are you? Because I mean, who hasn't seen Cordain, come out immediately with some sort of press release? Anytime something gets published in the scientific literature that goes against the paleo fantasy narrative. So it's like this is like almost to me like outright cover up. He had to have known about this research, I just
yeah it's hard to believe that he wouldn't have known about it. And now that you're bringing it up, and when you actually sit down and think about it critically, as far as whether or not they knew about it, either way, it just doesn't look good. Because if he did know about it, then he's presenting a paradigm that's not accurate. And if he didn't know about it, then how much trust can we really put into his knowledge about ancestral diet?
Right. Well, so time for another distinction. We're not saying that his his vision or prescription of, quote, the paleo diet, unquote, is unhealthy. That's not the argument. The argument is that it in no way represents it's a completely cherry picked deal. That if you look back in 2000s, low carb was becoming popular again, and low fat was also popular. It's almost kind of like the whole low carb, non-starchy vegetables combined with lean meats, and hell, even canola oil was in his first book, as opposed to like butter or lard or whatever. So it's almost like he's just trying to create a popular narrative that like straddles these two things, call it the paleo diet to make a distinction, but not do the paleo diet and explicitly cover up or ignore what the paleo diet was, and there was already the evidence from the Catawbans, because that research was previous to this whole thing. I think he did that in the 80s. And then this ongoing research was going on at the same time, but instead, let's look at scrapings off of ancient teeth and bones in camp, and maybe observe what people are eating in camp. Does that about cover it?
Yeah, I think I don't want to speak to what Dr. Cordain's intentions were because I don't know. But I do, and I also don't want to discount the quite valuable data that he provided in his 2000 publication, because it is a very interesting analysis and it does provide a lot of helpful data. It's only one piece of the puzzle, and unfortunately, that one piece that a lot of subsequent research has been based upon, and not just research, but also popular opinion. That being said, I do think that more and more people are starting to realize that there really is like no single paleo diet, and they're finding a lot of success implementing different, eating more carbohydrates and just eating a more whole foods diet in general, rather than focusing on any tunnel visioned type of dietary pattern. And so in itself is slowly moving in that direction. But I think it could get there a lot faster if people would be more aware research actually says, because there is still a large amount of people who stick to the canonical 2000 diet idea.
Right. So what is your, so let's just so we covered this, and let's just briefly cover what is, give us your take on a decent diet average. There's always going to be outliers, and as a nutritionist, you're going to be probably predominantly dealing with people with problems. So what's your recommendations for the people without your average person, normal weight, good good energy, good sleep, all these things. What would be your general recommendations for from the standpoint of what you've seen as a nutritionist?
Well, for the general person, my primary focus is almost always going to be towards protein. And that's because I think that the majority of people don't eat enough protein. And if they do, then they don't eat it in what I would say like a proper way. Like it's a very skewed intake. They have none at breakfast and eat a bunch at dinner rather than having it more evenly distributed. And then there's, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a lot of athletes who eat too much protein, in my opinion, or at least more than they actually need, who might see benefits to their performance and such if they would reduce it and replace it with more energy-providing macronutrients. I also think that the focus on protein has a lot of downstream effects on overall health, simply because it lets you focus on the food sources that they're getting it from, and replacing bacon and sausage with leaner cuts of meat and dairy and things like that. So it really addresses just a fundamental part of the diet that impacts a lot of different areas. And for protein intake, I don't like to use percentages because they're meaningless. How much protein you need is dependent on how much body mass you have. And a general recommendation for the average person is between 1.4 and 2 grams per kilogram. With protein set, and it's basically, what type of diet do you prefer? If they like eating a higher fat diet, and we're just dealing with averages again, there's always exceptions. If they like eating a higher fat diet, then by all means eat a higher fat diet. Just make sure that you consume at least 150 grams of carbs per day to cover the basic needs of the body and to prevent excessive breakdown of protein to produce glucose.
Right. Okay. Now in terms of that, so in terms of getting adequate protein, and whether you want to skew it more towards fat or more towards carbohydrate for the rest, what would be the better way to do it? Would it? And I'll present two alternatives. So, would you rather see a person go towards, if they like the higher fat element, get your protein, but go towards the more fattier proteins, ribs, things like that, that are a little bit more on the fatty side but it's still a whole food, right? Versus going towards the leaner cuts of protein combined with the more carbohydrate, if you're going that way, or a person who wants to go the higher fat side to eat whatever protein, but then just put a half cube of butter on it, tablespoons of coconut oil, lots of added fat. Do you see the distinction I'm making? Could you address that?
Yeah. Definitely, I think my personal opinion on the matter and what I believe the evidence base overwhelmingly supports is that eating lean cuts of meat and obtaining your fats primarily from plants is going to be the healthiest dietary option. And by plants, I am not referring to industrial seed oils or any of that crap. I mean whole food plants such as nuts, avocado, olives, coconut. And you don't need to eat a lot of those to add up either. I mean, if someone's eating a high-fat diet, it might only take a couple handful of nuts to satisfy their daily requirement.
Right. Interesting.
So yeah, I'm definitely of the opinion that regardless of how much fat is in your diet, the healthiest option would be to consume that fat from whole food plant sources such as nuts, avocado, olives, coconut, whatever.
And then so it is kind of approaching something that looks more like the original paleo diet, just to be honest about it, right? Because that's what Cordain was talking about. So, but then we still have the carb thing to deal with. So if you're gonna go to a much higher carb kind of thing, and you're gonna have your and even to the sugar extreme. So you not only you may have some of your tubers, but you're having honey, lots of berries or other sugary fruits. Well, berries aren't particularly sugary, but you could incorporate more sugary fruits. But so you're getting much more starch and sugar. But if you still have to get the protein, then you're still talking about more leaner cuts of protein. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Regardless of the diet, protein should come primarily from whole food sources that are lean cuts of meat, fatty fish, lean fish. And, when I say lean cuts, it's like, look, if you want to have a fattier cut, every once in a while or whatever, then by all means do it. None of this is do or die. It's just
And
80% of the time, aim for when you eat meat, have it be lean meat.
yeah, and I and that, you know what? Here's a cool thing. You can do a lot with lean meat anyway. But the thing is, too, is even depending on what your mix is between lean and fattier meats, like probably ribs being one of the most fattiest of the cuts. Um, the thing is what you, especially if you're going towards the more fattier cuts, you don't want to be adding fat. You don't want to be like pouring butter over it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do that, right?
Hmm.
So that's especially that you want to really limit the added fat, I would say. So is, if I'm getting this correct, you're doing leaner cuts, maybe you're fatty, maybe leaner cuts combined with the vegetable fats, the avocado, the coconut, the olives, nuts from the plant community. And if you're going to go higher carb, then you're switching out those fatty plants with more sugary plants or starchy plants. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, we've covered a lot here, and you just recently got your master's. You just kicked off your business, and how do you do your consulting? Like email, Skype, phone, or I assume you could do it in person too, right? If someone is up there in Seattle or they want to fly out to see you.
Yeah, I do have an office location for in-person consultations for anyone who's in the greater Seattle area who wants to do that.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the online consults go, those are pretty extensive in that I email you several forms that should take you a minimum of 1 week to fill out because one of the forms is a 3-day food log.
Uh-huh.
And after you send the forms back to me, I will analyze everything and write up what usually ends up being about a 10-page detailed summary of my thoughts on your diet. And then I go over that with you through a phone call or Skype call or whatever is most convenient for you to discuss my thoughts more in depth, from my mouth rather than just reading them off a piece of paper. And it also gives you an opportunity to ask clarifying questions and any of that stuff.
So you're like kind of serious about this?
Yeah, kind of.
Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and I think we came in right at about the right sweet spot for time here. Covered it, and I will put all the links in. And Alex, I wish you a good day and a very successful career. I think you speak a lot of sense, and especially the whole damn community owes you a debt of gratitude for putting this out here when, as far as I can see, nobody else would.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, for those interested, again, the journal that it was published in is called the Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior. And they have very sporadic publications, but every time they do, I am never disappointed.
Yeah.
And that's just because I like looking at things from an evolutionary perspective.
Now
So,
online they can search you on Facebook. Obviously, you're on Facebook. Where can they see your writings mostly? Your blog writings?
so I write at a couple places. I did a lot of blogging at Superhuman Radio, which I no longer do. I'm starting up my own blog at my website, leaf-nutrition.com, which I hope to start getting things up there soon. I do spontaneous blog posts at subversity.com with Adele Musa. He's a great friend and a mentor of mine.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
the stuff that guy pumps out. So it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, he's awesome. And then the main place where I do my writing is actually for examine.com, for any of you who are familiar with it.
Okay.
I'm one of the researchers that works at examine.com, and I write articles for their Examine Research Digest.
Okay.
So those of you who are interested in that, I would recommend checking that out.
Yes, and we'll get all those for those who aren't in the car listening to this. We'll have those at the blog post for the podcast, which I hope to get up very shortly. So thank you again, Alex, for being here, taking time out of your day, and best wishes and for a lot of success for you and for all the people you're going to help.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, great.
Hi, this is Carl Seddon from Elixir Probiotic here in the United Kingdom. No doubt you've already heard of us by now, but if you're new to Elixir, then let me quickly highlight just one of the features that makes it so effective. Elixir Probiotic has a daily dosage of 500 billion bacterial units. That's 500 billion, about 50 times the strength of the average 10 billion CFU probiotic. That's incredibly high. Or is it? No, in my opinion, it's only just approaching a large enough dosage. Why? Well, the human gut contains anywhere from 50 to 100 trillion microbes, so a conventional 10 billion CFU probiotic is being outmatched by a ratio of up to 10,000 to 1. That's like one man versus an entire town. But with Elixir's 50 times larger dose, now we can make a noticeable impact. Now there are many more features which you can learn about on freetheanimal.com. Gastric-resistant capsules, our hermetic packaging technology, Elixir's short-course approach, and plenty of user feedback. Oh, one last thing before I go. We've just released our new blend, version 2, and the feedback has been outstanding. If you want to check out the latest blend and all the information regarding that, then visit elixirfta.com. That's elixafta.com. That URL will take you direct to the V2 blend and make sure you go direct to the most up-to-date version of Elixir. That URL again is elixafta.com. Thank you.
So I'll close with a bit of a conclusion in the words of Alex Leaf. Quote, based on previous calculations of energy expenditure of the Hadza tribesmen, it can be estimated that they consume roughly 90% of their total daily energy expenditure on average while foraging outside of camp. Of course, there is significant variation in these values, with 1/5 of the forages resulting in no acquired food. Still, up to the point, researchers have represented the Hadza diet only using in-camp data, which is going to be inaccurate in light of their foraging habits. These findings complement other Hadza research showing that men consumed little of the food they brought back to camp themselves, instead sharing it with their kin. This sharing now makes sense because the men have already eaten while out foraging, can therefore spare the food. Indeed, it may be that Hadza men's foraging is driven by the goals of getting enough calories to eat themselves. Foods such as honey and ripe berries are eaten on the spot almost entirely, may simply be a strategy to both feed themselves and pursue riskier food types, like animals, that have a higher chance of failure upon pursuit. Thus, coming back empty-handed may not always represent that food acquisition failed, but rather that it failed to produce a surplus to share. The current study makes clear that the Hadza diet is strikingly different outside of camp than inside of camp. with only 16% of all acquired honey brought into camp and contributing 85% of the calories consumed while foraging, depending on the season. It is likely that honey consumption in the Hadza population is underreported, meaning that carbohydrate and sugar consumption is underreported as well. In fact, a recent study using a large cross-cultural database showed that most hunter-gatherers in warm climates exploit honey, suggesting the Hadza tribe may not be the only hunter-gatherer tribe to have a significant higher carbohydrate than we were led to believe. Another interesting observation is the difference in nutrient and caloric density of the Hadza men's and women's diets. The women eat primarily within camp and thus focus their consumption on the tubers they gathered in combination with any game that was brought into camp. Additionally, 80% of the game is small and therefore lean. Thus, the women's diet is likely focused on starchy carbohydrates and protein, whereas the men's diet is sugary carbohydrates and protein. Either way, these certainly were not low carbohydrate diets. I'll see you next time.